Excellent. So welcome, everyone. My name is John Fowler. I'm from the United Nations Association Australia Queensland Division, and in particular, the Peace and Security Program, who has facilitated this conversation that you have joined us for this evening. I would like to formally acknowledge the First Nations people and their ancestors. Today, I'm in Brisbane, and the land of the Yagara and Turrbal people. I would like to pay my respects to Indigenous people joining us here today. And as a member of the United Nations Association Australia and consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I would like to advocate for the recognition of Indigenous voices and the important contributions they make to Australia's cultural, spiritual, and political discourse. Now, welcome to our third seminar in this series and the second sponsored by UNAA Queensland Branch. Now, this is the first of two events actually this week occurring, with the second, which is the UNAA Queensland Human Rights Commemoration, which is occurring at 5 o'clock Australian Eastern Standard Time on Wednesday. This is also an online event, and I'll put a link within the chat for anybody who is interested in attending. Now, the United Nations Association Australia is a volunteer organisation, and as such, we are encouraging all of you to consider becoming a member and contributing in whatever way that you can. We appreciate all of your support in its many forms. Now, as most of you are aware, the Israel-Palestine conflict is one of several conflicts that warrant our attention as members of an international civil society. However, the nature of the conflict, the potential divide it creates in communities, and the stress that this conflict continues to put on the international institutions like the UN make a compelling argument for this conflict being one of the most significant in recent history. Now, there is no better time, in my view, to come together and have these significant, complex, and sometimes contentious discussions. It is the pursuit of understanding and insight that these seminars have been based on, and we have put them together in the hope that we can all come away today a little better informed. Now, I'll now introduce you to our moderator for today, and this will be the last you hear from me. Dr. Jack Shield recently graduated from the University of Queensland with his thesis titled Nationcraft, Nationalist Visions of International Order. As an early career scholar, he is pursuing a research agenda on the relationship between historical, political imaginaries and ordering. Right, I will now hand over control to Dr. Jack Shields and our illustrious guests. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Okay, thank you very much, John, and thank you very much to the UNAA in addition for hosting us. So thank you for joining us for this event entitled The Settler Colonial Framework and Its Limits in Israel-Palestine. And similar to John, before we begin, I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I and many of our audience will be joining, and that is the Yagara and Turrbal peoples. I would also like to acknowledge their ongoing struggles for justice. Now, Australia itself is a settler colony with a history of ongoing colonial violence and dispossession. And what's more, Australia has been a significant site in the academic development of settler colonial studies, with Lorenzo Veroncini and Patrick Wolfe playing outsized roles in the formation of this as a scholarly paradigm. So the questions of this talk are deeply pertinent for those of us joining from Aboriginal land. So the connection between these contexts is perhaps one that we will hear a little bit more of in the course of the discussion as well. My name is Dr. Jack Shield. I'm a sessional lecturer, early career researcher here at UQ, the University of Queensland. And I'm also part of a small collective that has been organising this series about violence in Palestine-Israel. This is the third event in that series. Past webinars address the politics of non-violence and its limits, and the applicability of the doctrine responsibility to protect to Gaza. And we are hopeful of putting on more in the new year. This will be the last one for this year, but join the mailing list if you haven't already, or otherwise stay tuned for what we have in the pipeline. I'd like to briefly outline some of the surrounding context that frames this discussion. So the official death toll in Gaza is now 44,500, which with numbers likely much higher. 70,000 Palestinians are trapped in northern Gaza at the moment. They have been without resupplying humanitarian aid for 2 weeks and face the risk of imminent starvation. The International Criminal Court recently took the remarkable move of handing down arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant over suspected war crimes, in addition to the Hamas leader Mohammed Deif, suspected deceased. And what's more, just over a week ago, Amnesty International released a report concluding that Israel's actions in Gaza constitutes a genocidal campaign. On the political scene, a fragile peace has been negotiated in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah. The Israeli government currently shows no signs of letting up the campaign in Gaza, however. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich has recently indicated that Israel would pursue an extended presence in Gaza, but uncertainties abound here about what any kind of post-conflict situation would be. Smotrich has indeed also urged annexation of the West Bank, which is a slightly more neglected theatre, but where over 700 Palestinians have also been killed, often by settler violence, since the Hamas attack of October 7 last year. If we look to other contexts, we can see that settler violence is also in evidence, albeit in more attenuated forms than in historic Palestine. In Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the US, Indigenous populations continue to be subject to state violence, environmental racism, mass coercion, mass incarceration, and other forms of coercion. Racial cleavages persist despite the avowedly multicultural and formally equal nature of these polities. The no vote in Australia's voice referendum and mass protests in New Zealand underscore this. In all these contexts, settler violence has also been met with resistance. And if we look at the ICJ decision about Israel in January of this year, it was notably brought by South Africa, a country deeply shaped by its own history of settler colonialism and resistance to it. And that case was clearly motivated by a sense of solidarity bequeathed to South Africa by that experience. And the twin experiences between those states of apartheid and ethnic partition as well. So how do we take stock of the potential lessons, analogies, and solidarities across these contexts? How can we think broadly about structural similarities and the translocal character of settler colonialism, while also being historically sensitive and mindful of contextual differences? Moreover, what are the possibilities for decolonization in Israel-Palestine, and how are these afforded and or constrained by the framework of settler colonialism? These are some of the challenges that await us in the discussion. So today I'm joined by two scholars who are fantastically placed to help us understand the settler colonial framework, its applicability to Israel, and some of its potential limitations. Unfortunately, we are not joined by Dr. Rachel Busbridge of the Australian Catholic University due to unforeseen personal circumstances. And this is, of course, disappointing, as Rachel has written quite articulately on the academic settler colonial turn and indeed some of its normative limitations in Palestine. And I would strongly encourage anyone interested to go and check out her work. But nevertheless, we are left with two excellent scholars and, what's more, a little bit more time for Q&A. So we'll be operating with a 45-45 split, with the first 45 minutes designated to discussion and then the final 45 to Q&A. So Dr. Marcelo Svirsky is a senior lecturer at the University of Wollongong. He researches settler colonial societies, particularly Israel-Palestine, and focuses particularly on questions of decolonization and transformation in these settings. He is the author of numerous books, including Arab-Jewish Activism in Israel-Palestine, After Israel, Towards Cultural Transformation, and most recently, From Shared Life to Co-Resistance in Historic Palestine. After Israel explores the ways in which Jewish Israelis can begin to divest themselves of Zionist identities, while the latter explores the destruction of shared forms of Jewish Arabic life that attended the Zionist state's creation. Next, we have Dr. Teodora Todorova joining us from the Department of Sociology at the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom, where she is an assistant professor. Her work broadly concerns theories and practices of ethico-political responsibility in the context of ethnic conflict. She has written about post-conflict resolution in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the commemoration of the Nakba, and the possibilities of decolonial solidarity in Israel-Palestine. Her 2021 book, Decolonial Solidarity in Palestine-Israel, Settler Colonialism and Resistance from Within, explores the possibilities of Indigenous settler solidarity in ending partition by way of exploration of various civil society groups and their commitment to decolonization. So as I mentioned, this panel is going to proceed with the opening 45 minutes dedicated to discussion between our panelists, moderated by myself. Following that, there will be an additional 45 minutes for audience Q&A. So if you do have a question, feel free to put that in the Q&A box. These will be screened by our behind-the-scenes gophers. Thank you, gophers. And they'll be passed on to me, and I'll pose them to one or both of our panelists. Right, so with those introductions aside, I think I might start off with the first question, and I might begin on a more personal note before we get into the substance of the discussion on settler colonialism. And I was just wondering how your personal backgrounds influenced your arrival at this scholarly topic. So, Marcelo, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, sure. Well, I was born and raised in Buenos Aires, Argentina, within the framework of the Jewish community there. When I was 20, I moved to Israel and actually spent most of my life as an Israeli citizen. And only then, at some point, I arrived here in Australia. So developed my, I would say, first political inclinations, being an Israeli citizen, as well as my whole academic studies I conducted there. So that's basically the why. I've been an activist. I think I can use the title of a friend of the Palestinian struggle. And I have been doing this since I remember. So at some point, I sort of brought those preoccupations into my academic research. So that's how it started.
Thank you. Okay, and Teodora.
Thank you, first of all, Jack, for hosting us, and thank you to the UNAA as well. I have a not so dissimilar story. So I'm originally from Bulgaria. I was born in Bulgaria, which has a different history because it's a post-communist Eastern European country where I remember, for example, being a very small child when the Bulgarian synagogue was reopened because religion was not encouraged as a practice under communism. And I attended the only synagogue we had in Sofia more or less on a regular basis until I I moved to the UK when I was 11, shortly before I turned 12, and I actually had my bar mitzvah in the UK, so in England, in London. And so I've been a part of, broadly speaking, what is referred to as the Jewish diaspora, although I would like a better term than a diaspora, given that I'm very European, both in terms of where I was born and where I've lived most of my life. And when I was 19 years old, I went on a trip to Israel and Palestine for the first time with the Union of Jewish Students. The trip was organized by the Union of Jewish Students. And that is really when I became interested in Palestine and Israel. Before then, I was Jewish and I was practicing Judaism. And now I'm more secular, but the first time I really became interested in Palestine and Israel was then. And I was left with a lot of questions rather than answers. That trip was there kind of to present the Israeli state narrative and to also encourage you to go back to your country of origin and become an advocate for Israel. And I was literally left with just loads of questions. I didn't feel that any of the perspectives or narratives that were presented before me were entirely accurate or convincing. And so I really took this as a very academic approach. So I didn't come from, I was an activist in relation to refugee rights, to women's rights, etc. But I was never really an activist in relation to Palestine and Israel until that trip. And then when I came back, I took a very academic approach, which was I have to learn about this and I have to understand how is it, that there is Israel in Asia, and given the kind of the histories of European Judaism that I'm much more familiar with. And from then on, once I started to study this, got the opportunity to do a PhD, it felt that it followed on that one would be active in responding to Palestinian calls for justice and decolonization. And that is also how I came to the Settler Colonial framework. So the Journal of Settler Colonial Studies more or less was established right at the end of my PhD. And there was always an absence while I was doing my PhD. And that absence was settler colonial theory. And now I finally, after so many years, had the opportunity to really have that framework explain everything that I was studying and thinking about during my PhD. Beforehand, it was the only academic explanatory framework that made sense of everything, whereas before I was just asking a lot of questions and felt that I did not have a full answer.
Wow. Okay, that's great, and it kind of anticipates some of the appeal of the settler colonial framework, at least for you. So next, I think we should just start with dissecting some of the basics. And so, can you tell us what is settler colonialism? So, what makes it distinct from colonialism or mass immigration? Marcelo, do you want to take that one, Marcelo?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jack. Well, you mentioned before two names, two pivotal names in this field, Patrick Wolf and Lorenzo Veracini. Now, I just wanted to clarify first, this is a sort of specialized conversation, to be honest, and it's only natural that we will be using some terms from within this particular field. But nevertheless, if some of the terms that are used, the audience is not familiar with, so very happy to clarify things. Now, yes, generally the conversation about settler colonialism starts with a comparison with classical colonialism. And I think that here Lorenzo Veracini has been very comprehensive in his work, providing that the fundamental really difference between settler colonialism and what we call classical colonialism lies in the permanency of those people coming from the outside onto the land that we are discussing. It's about that permanency of those that are coming, and also about the impacts of that permanency on the land and on life on the land. as Lorenzo himself used to say, settler colonialism is about those who came to stay. Whereas in contrast, in classical colonialism, actually they come to exploit. So even though these two forms have in the past coexisted and may still coexist, for instance, if we look at South America, though it started with classical colonialism from late 15th century, at some point in the 19th century, forms of settler colonialism enter into the frame, and those forms ever since mixed. And I think that a similar proposition can be said about Israel since 1967. I reckon we will not have the time to expand, but since the conquest that Israel procured in that war, these two forms of colonialism began to be merged, whereas I would say that before that, the whole Zionist project was focused on the, what we can be defined as settler colonialism. That is, it was about those that came to stay and what they did on the land. Now, when we use that term that came to stay, this may sound somehow perhaps innocent, like innocent immigration, actually. The problem, of course, is that there is nothing innocent about the ways by which those that came to stay establish their life on the land. For them, the new land, or perhaps some may argue the re-encountered land. So the whole issue about settler colonialism, it lies exactly there. How these people that came from the outside, they establish their new forms of life. Now, here we can reconnect with Patrick Wolf, because I think that he provided with the most useful, if not exact, definition of what this means. Wolf, famously known, used this idea of displacement, replacement. So you displace those that are living on the land in order to replace them with your own new form of life. And if we want to go up one level, in a higher level of abstraction, I would say that displacement, replacement for Wolf meant that famous idiom of the logic of elimination. Because actually what you do when you displace in order to replace, you are starting, or you are in the process of eliminating that native form of life that pre-existed your arrival. Now, up to here, I think that there is quite a consensus within the field. And at this point, I would like a bit to diverge, to give a bit of what I think is more precise content to this idea of Wolf of displacement, replacement, or if you like, logic of elimination. Now, there is a term that is not much applied in among settler colonial scholars. I'm referring to the notion of ethnocide. Now, ethnocide, I think, captures pretty well what's actually happening in that process of displacement, replacement. What is ethnocide? Ethnocide was first coined as a term by the Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin. He was part of the prosecution legal team at the Nuremberg trials. He is the same person who coined the term genocide. Now, there is a scholar, a French scholar called Robert Jolin, who in 1970, in a book called L'Épée Blanche, he began making a more specific use of the term ethnocide. And according to Jolin, what matters about ethnocide is the end result. And the end result is the destruction of a way of life. That is what ethnocide is about. Now, when we say destruction, or if coming back to Wolf, if we use the term elimination, we need to be very careful here, because I don't believe that we are meaning one act of annihilation, or even if we like, one event of annihilation. We are rather referring to a sort of unremitting set of practices, always ongoing, extinguishing the native form of life, that form of life that these people coming from the outside first encounter. Now, this doesn't come never in itself, this extinguishment tendency, but now to reinsert Wolf, we must say that that disposition to extinguish, to destroy the form of life that pre-existed those who arrived is always already accompanied by the creation, expansion, and eventually the domination of the form of life, the new form of life, advanced by those who came from the outside. I'm just a couple of more sentences. So again, by displacement, replacement, I believe that ethnocide, the destruction of the existing ways of life, is as an interesting way to understand the process of what's going on from the viewpoint of the relationships between the people coming from the outside and the people living in the inside at the moment those coming of the outside are arriving. So this is always two sides of the same event. These two things go hand in hand together and cannot be separated. And this is what characterizes, I would say, settler colonialism at its core. Just one last point, which I believe it's crucial to understand, that this position, that tendency to destroy an existing form of life. And here I think it's very important to ask the following question. Who is actually the agent of those actions? Those actions practicing the ethnocide of the native. This is a question, I believe, that settler colonial discipline has disregarded, and perhaps here I'm jumping, Jack, to the last question, so I'll stop here and try to resume later. But I believe that this question of who actually is doing that job of ethnociding the native is very important. And I think that settler colonial colleagues have assumed a very narrow approach in regards to who is the agent of settler colonial practices, by focusing solely on the state, on high politics, and on the institutions of the state. I'll try to expand on this in the following questions. Thank you, Jack.
No worries. Yeah, very comprehensive, and also good foreshadowing of the last question about limitations. So thank you. Okay, Teodora, do you have anything to add there?
Thank you. I do have a couple of things to add. I think that everything Marcelo has said is absolutely fundamental to understanding what settler colonialism is, but I also want to foreground a couple of things. So firstly, we in settler colonial theory have the tendency to try and draw a stricter distinction between pure colonialism or imperial colonialism. So for example, the British colonizing the vast majority of the world, and that kind of famous dictum of the sun never set on the British Empire because it spanned 5 continents. And then settler colonialism is something that is much more particular, and it's about those who come to stay, displacing the indigenous and becoming a new nation, but also making new claims to nativeness, because that is one of the key aspects of settler colonialism, is that the settler wishes to become the native and wishes to institute themselves as the native, and that requires the elimination and the denial of native sovereignty. And as Marcelo has already pointed towards this, it's ethnocidal and genocidal in nature, that desire to displace the native and institute settler sovereignty. Having said that, though, both pure colonialism and imperial colonialism and settler colonialism do share the denial of indigenous sovereignty. And I think that is something that we actually need to pay much more attention within the settler colonial framework, least of all because imperialist politics and settler colonial politics is premised on the denial of indigenous sovereignty, and that continues to play itself out in the way that powerful states support one another and express solidarity with one another, and actually do not take the humanity of indigenous people into account and deny their particular histories of displacement and genocidal violence as well. So I think that it's important for us to kind of foreground this, to understand that what is particular about settler colonialism is that it gives rise to a new type of nationality. That, for example, the British did not stop being British when they arrived in India. They carried on being British, and this is what they took with them. They were in control of the land and exploiting the resources and etc. Whereas quite clearly what is very particular, perhaps not unique, but what is particular about settler colonial nationalism is that it gives rise to a new nation, whether it is Australian, American, Canadian, New Zealand, or Israeli. And obviously with Israel is an ongoing project. So this is what is also particular to thinking about Israel and Palestine for a settler colonial framework, that Israel has not created an Israeli nationality in a way that the Americans have a settler colonial nationality, or the Canadians do. So that is also what is particular to that case. I fully agree with Marcelo that for myself, these are the two things that really matter in terms of trying to understand the role that settler colonialism can play in understanding Palestine and Israel, in terms of giving rise to a new nationality that is premised on the displacement, elimination, and denial of indigenous existence and indigenous sovereignties. But it also shares the denial of indigenous sovereignty with pure colonialism, and that is playing out in contemporary geopolitics.
Okay, great. So also some important similarities to keep in mind with the more classical colonialism as well. Okay, so now that we've got the broad strokes of settler colonial theory, how does the application of this transform our understanding of the present conflict and the violence playing out in Gaza? Marcelo, do you want to pick up that one first?
Yes. Well, first of all, I must say that this is quite refreshing. I don't usually find myself agreeing with the other speakers. It feels really nice. Well, if I move forward from the sort of premises that I presented before about ethnocide, the continuing aiming at destroying the native way of life in order to replace it with an alternative one. So there are quite a lot of questions that this opens to. To begin with, I think we should ask about the nature of the process of ethnocide, of native life in Palestine. First of all, from an historical perspective, during the early stages of Zionism, and I'm talking since very, very late 19th century onwards. In respect to that modus operandi of ethnocide in the early stage of Zionism, my own answer has been that I kind of double up on Wolf by calling it double elimination. And just briefly, only if we have time later, I can expand briefly to say that by double elimination, what I mean is that when the Zionists arrived to Palestine, what they encountered, it was a mix of forms of life, among which we also find a sort of, let's call it minor shared life between the Palestinian Arab majority, Muslim and Christians, and the Jewish minority living in Palestine back then, which mainly were Oriental Jewish people, Sephardim, and Mizrahim, and there was even a smaller minority of Ashkenazi ultra-religious Jews. And those forms of shared life were also the target of this ethnocide carried out from the very beginning. So in the case of Palestine, I think it gets a bit more complex than the situations that we find in other geographies. I will also ask, coming from that perspective, what happened with those modus operandi of ethnocide after the early stage, how they evolve, how they look like today, which kind of elements were added during time as the Settler Colonial project evolved, it became stronger. What happened there? How Palestinian life in this case was addressed as a target of destruction. And obviously, and I think this is very important, and I feel that I would like to say that Patrick Wolf here, I believe, had a kind of weakness in his writing in the question of resistance, or to use another term, escapes or breakthroughs from the settled colonial situation. And I believe that the question of escape, the question of resistance is also very important to be addressed when we understand what actually is the dynamic of that elimination. So this is briefly a kind of model, if you like, that I will be using if I am to apply the Settler Colonial framework. I will expand later, perhaps I'll leave this to the last question in terms of what actually is particular and limiting at the same time in applying this model to the case of Palestine.
Thank you very much. Teodora.
Thank you. I guess I'll have to start with a limitation, because for me, I came through to this, like I kind of gave you a personal history, but there is another aspect to this personal way into settler colonial theory and trying to understand Palestine and Israel for settler colonial theory. And that is Britain's historic responsibility, both in terms of Britain as an imperial power that gave rise to the Anglophone settler colonial world, but in the case of Palestine and Israel, it's not an Anglophone settler colonial world, yet it is a British settler colony, historically speaking, or at least the legacy of British imperialism manifests itself in the settler colonial context of Palestine and Israel. So there is that aspect in terms of understanding it as historical legacies and trying to understand also the ways forward in terms of Marcelo spoke about, in response to the first question, about not thinking of settler colonists as migrants, right? And for me, what settler colonial theory implies we need to think about, but is also limited in the sense that it has not successfully been able to think about this, is how can we move from a settler colonizer to a settler who is not a colonizer? And not just thinking of the settler as a migrant, because we all have migration experiences, we all spoke about those migration experiences, but rather literally thinking about the way in which settler colonial theory might allow us to think about the possibility of decolonizing the settler and the possibility of a new mode of coexistence emerging out of this. That is not colonial, that is not eliminationist, that is not premised on the denial of indigenous sovereignty, and that foregrounds the Palestinian right to the land, the Palestinian right to be in the land, the Palestinian right to return to the land, because we're also speaking about the ways in which, if we look at the case of Palestine and Israel for settler colonialism, we need to acknowledge and remember that millions of Palestinians have been displaced from their homeland since 1948, and that displacement is ongoing, and they have been arguing for their right to return to their historic homelands. And so this is for me what that settler colonial framework also allows us to think about, the way in which there may be all these possibilities to decolonize, in terms of, if we accept the settler colonialism gives birth to a new nation, then that itself actually also has its antithesis, in the sense that the settlers could actually become part of of a new nation that is potentially decolonial. So it's the promise of that that makes settler colonial theory really useful for me. Although we do not, if we look at it comparatively in relation to other settler colonial contexts, we don't see a lot of evidence for this. And in particular, I'm thinking of in terms of what has happened in Australia very recently, and also what is happening in Aotearoa, New Zealand right now, with an attack on treaty. And Australia doesn't have a history of treaty. New Zealand does have a history of treaty. That has often been given as an example of a settler colonial context that is in the process of decolonization, yet there has actually now been an active effort to undo some of those moves towards recognition and sovereignty for the indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so it's a limitation of the framework in terms of how do we get past the colonizing part and how do we move actually to decolonization and indigenous sovereignty. But it also promises us that. And I think this is what makes it useful and perhaps even somewhat hopeful.
Great, thank you both. Yeah, and just briefly, Marcelo, reading on the logic of elimination, where you talked about the double elimination, was quite illuminating for me, the way in which those shared spaces actually had to be eliminated as well. Shared life between Arabs and Jews was also part of the project. And since we're all anticipating the limitations a little bit, I might as well just jump in myself and say, Teodora, what you were just mentioning. Also, I was reminded of McCune and Strakosch, where they talk about the settler colonial theory having difficulty transcending itself. Yeah, but that's to wait a little bit. So what kind of parallels with other conflicts does the settler colonial framework draw our attention to? And I might throw back to Teodora first this time.
Thank you. For me, the two key sites of comparison that have been very useful to think about Palestine and Israel for a settler colonial frame are Algeria and also South Africa. So I have never drawn any utility from the Anglophone settler colonies in terms of how things could pan out. There are those two contexts of Algeria and South Africa that speak to me about the possibility of decolonization, but also their two historical contexts and ongoing context in the case of South Africa that very explicitly draw on decolonization as a politics rather than just a descriptive. And they provide alternative strategies. Obviously, for those of you who are not familiar with this, Algeria is an Arab North African country. It was colonized and settled by the French before its independence in the 60s. And it is often cited as a comparative case because of its history of decolonial struggle, also because it is an Arab state, and therefore there is a kind of comparison. The Palestinian people are Arab and speak Arabic. And it's an example of where ultimately after Algerian independence, the settlers chose to leave. So they chose to opt out of the possibility to cohabit as not as equals perhaps, but certainly to cohabit as settlers who are not also colonizers. And that was not actually the intention. So very often a lot of people seem to think that the way decolonization in Algeria panned out, and if you are interested, you should read Frantz Fanon, because he theorized this in great length in terms of anti-colonial scholarship that is useful to think about settler colonialism before the field of settler colonialism was established. And Fanon quite explicitly, speaks about all the ways in which the idea is ultimately to make a new nation, right? So that's where I get this idea of decolonization as becoming a new nation that is based on decolonial and decolonized coexistence. But Algeria is often cited as the example where the settler colonists, they chose to leave because they were so racialized in their thinking about the colonized that they could. It was beneath them to even imagine coexisting with those that they did not see as rights-bearing citizens and were racialized as practically non-human. South Africa is often compared and contrasted. Again, it's worth pointing out that yes, South Africa was once a British colony, but the white minority community that established the apartheid regime between 1948 and 1994 was, by their own definition, Afrikaans, and the language they speak is Dutch derived, and very often people do not really think about this. So sometimes people think about South Africa also as an Anglophone settler colony, but it is actually the anti-apartheid Black African resistance who adopted English as the common language, because the Black African nations in South Africa spoke about 11 different languages, and English actually became the language of the anti-apartheid struggle, because it was the one language they could use to speak together and to communicate and coordinate with one another. And so that is a kind of also a decolonial moment for the English language that we often forget about. So this for me are the two bits, and obviously anti-apartheid happened. So that struggle was achieved, and apartheid formally ended in 1994. But the process of decolonization is still ongoing. The white South African minority did choose to stay, and they're part of a process of decolonial politics, but that process is still very much ongoing. And it's becoming increasingly, for example, a question of land redistribution, because one of the things that settler colonialism entrenches is a very exploitative capitalist system that is also racialized in its nature. So it's based on racial stratification. And so that decolonization process is still ongoing. However, it is the one that still gives us the most hope and the most traction, because it suggests that in the case of the Afrikaans, there is some desire to cohabit and some desire to think beyond racial politics. However imperfect that moment is, and it's still very much ongoing, but at least in contrast to the Algerian case, the possibility to deracialize and decolonize is there in spirit, and to extent in practice, because the people are still there, and a new education system is being thought through, and a new kind of economic also politics are increasingly being considered, even though it's still very much an ongoing process.
Great, thank you. So I might encourage those in the audience to put any questions that they have into the chat. I'm going to continue, I think, to the original plan, given that we have not advanced as sufficiently as I would have liked in our discussion yet. So, Marcelo, do you want to take that one?
Well, I think that Teodora quite covered the main points of marking parallels with Palestine. So I'll just say a word about, I mean, I can look at this question from a more conceptual angle, perhaps, in terms of the paradigm itself. And just to say that we know that there are certain conceptual wars between people about how to conceptualize this thing. I find that a bit pathetic, to be honest. I reject any fixation with paradigms. I'm in favor of whatever works in order to understand. And if I need to choose a test, I would say that as long as the model help us to imagine a breakthrough, so that will be enough for me. And if it doesn't, and if it keep us within, the walls of the republics of the letters, so that doesn't work for me anyway. I don't think that the settler colonial framework must be a kind of exclusionary lens to be settler colonial in itself, in the way it works, in the way that it separates disciplines and works. We may use the settler colonial framework. We may use other frameworks. For instance, I know that certain people prefer the apartheid paradigm to work, to analyze, to discuss this issue. I'm not against it. I think that, again, as long as we are able to grasp a good understanding that enables us to imagine another situation that will be good enough.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to sort of move to a more critical question, because there is so there's a recent piece in The Atlantic by Adam Kirsch, and it's been getting quite a lot of headway. I've been running into it continuously, and he seems to be on a bit of a junket. So he claims that settler colonialism is an ideology rather than a theory. And he writes that it was generated in the context of Anglo-Saxon settler colonies and applied, or rather misapplied, in his view, to Israel. And so some of the reasons that he provides here are the Jewish state only displaced rather than erased the people already living in Palestine. The native population rose after settlement. The present state of Israel did not expand to fill a continent, as was the case in the settler colonies of the US and Australia. And it's presently only, in fact, the size of New Jersey. And the case of, you have a clear case of sort of white supremacy in the other ones, whereas racial domination is not so clear in the case of Israel. And so to this, we could also add claims of Jewish return rather than settlement, and their claims of national self-determination. So I was wondering if I could get a response from the both of you about this critique that Israel does not fit the classic model of settler colonialism.
Yeah. Should I go to Teodora?
Teodora, why don't you take us through that one?
Thank you. I don't know where to begin. I don't know where to begin. Actually, I do know where to begin. Before I came to settler colonial theory quite explicitly in my work, I actually drew very heavily inspiration from the Latin American coloniality, modernity school of thought. So people like Walter Minolo and Arturo Escobar. And it's partly because of my own history. So I'm Sephardi by heritage, and the Bulgarian Jews are Sephardi. So they were people who moved from Andalusia, which is a part of modern day Spain, around the same time as Columbus discovered the Americas, and settlement in the continent of South and North America began, and actually began with South America. And the reason why I always found this particular school of thought much more useful than thinking about even the British colonies or the British settler colonies is precisely because it drew, in my view, a more complete history of internal colonization in Europe. So the takeover of the Catholic Church and the Catholic kings in Andalusia, and then the displacement of the Sephardi population to largely Ottoman-controlled lands at the time, because the Ottoman Muslim Empire was considered to be more welcoming towards people from different religious denominations and less intolerant than Christian Europe, as an example. And also it brings that into conversation with the so-called New World, right? So Columbus discovers America, and then the settler colonization and Christianization of South and North America begins. And they're basically, in a nutshell, these are like histories of otherization, of expulsion, and also the beginning of racialization that completely that have been ignored. So this idea that the Anglophone or the Anglo-Saxon settler colonies are white supremacist in the way that for example, the South American colonization by Europeans has not been, is to just, I don't know, have chosen to ignore the beginning of colonization of the Americas. And so, you know, that's really kind of important to see. What I also take from Patrick Wolf that's kind of related to this history is Patrick Wolf speaks about the arrival of European Jews and also later on as well, the Mizrahi incorporation into Israel and into the kind of the Jewish national identity that Israel has given birth to as deracination. So in Europe, we are lesser people and we are always Auslander, so we are always outsiders. And we're racialized as outsiders, right? So the idea of anti-Semitism is the idea that you're a Semite, right? And there is no Semite without an anti-Semite. Anti-Semitism gives birth to the notion of Semites. And that's racialization. It might not be quite explicitly about whiteness. So the idea of whiteness is a relatively contemporary phenomena. And also even in the United States of America, for example, a lot of Europeans, including Europeans who are not Jewish. So a lot of Europeans like the Polish, the Italians, the Portuguese, the Spanish are accepted into whiteness only in the 50s. And that's because Anglo-Saxon settlers tend to be Protestant, right? So there is a kind of also racialization of Catholicism that is taking place in relation to white supremacist taxonomies in the United States of America. And I know Australia less intimately, just to give you that as an example. So I think that we need to understand racialization as something that is not exclusively about whiteness or even white supremacy, although it is related to it, and white supremacy and whiteness as something that is, supreme, is part of this racialization process, that is part of the colonial history of Europe, quote unquote, discovering all these new lands and settling them and trying to bring them civilization. So we have all these civilizationist discourses that are racial, right? The idea that you're civilizing the heathen and bringing them culture because they did not have culture is a racial process, is a racializing process. And that coincides, this is for me why studying Latin America was so important for me, because it brought my own history of the internal Orientalism that was going on in Europe from around 1492 with the beginning of colonization and European settlement in South America, and then later on North America. And obviously we need to, pay more attention to the specificities of the Spanish conquests, and then later on the British and the French and the Dutch and so on. But there is a history of internal racialization in Europe that is exported to the rest of the world. And that dates for a very long time. And we also, for me, that also is then transported into how Jewish settlement in Palestine has taken place, including bringing all these Orientalist notions, racial notions, and also having internal stratifications. There is a lot of, for example, for some of your audience, they might not at all be familiar that Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, Sephardi are liturgies, but also they have become racial categories, right? So it used to be that the Mizrahi Jews were simply the Jews of Asia, and they practice a certain kind of liturgy. The Sephardi are the Jews of Andalus that moved to the Balkans, and we practice a different kind of liturgies. And the Ashkenazi are Central Eastern and Northern European Jews that practice a third type of liturgy. So it used to be about the religious practices that one basically engaged in as a Jewish person. But they become actually racial markers once the State of Israel is established. Including the fact that now, for example, Balkan Jews are considered to be Mizrahi, even though we come from the Balkans, which is a region in Europe. And these are racial practices that are internal taxonomies of what race looks like, as well as obviously the antagonism between the indigenous who are racialized as the other that cannot be assimilated. And I think this is, again, actually, we should highlight this as another example that makes settler colonialism distinct, because migrants, for example, can be assimilated. That's the idea. But the indigenous can never be assimilated. And so this is where one ends up either displacing in order to replace or eliminating in order to replace. And last but not least, I'm going to just finish with this. I am at the moment studying the settler movement Just to be clear for people, so I'm studying the settlers in the West Bank, so those who want to annex the West Bank as part of the biblical land of Judea and Samaria, in order to form Greater Israel sovereignty on the land of historic Palestine. They're part of the settler colonial history that predates the state of Israel, but also there's a very specific political movement that is gaining a lot of traction. So numerically, they're a minority, but they have politicians in government. So you mentioned Smotrich, for example, there is Ben-Gvir. They have politicians in the Israeli government who are manifesting their particular kind of geopolitical vision for what Israel should look like. And so to say that there is no expansionism, even if that expansionism is not looking forward to taking over a whole continent, is also to not be paying attention to what's being reported in the media. And also, it's also worth remembering that the state of Israel is quite a young settler colony, and therefore it is no longer thinkable for the majority of the world to be able to take over an entire continent in the way that the US, Canada, and the Spanish and Portuguese empires did in South America. So those moments of expanding across a whole land, as in the whole land of a continent, as in Australia, that was thinkable at a particular historical moment, which is no longer the way that the majority of the world thinks, at least of all because we have, for example, the United Nations. And the United Nations is an institution that has played quite a significant role in decolonization and thinking about, you know, the right of peoples to have national self-determination, including in potentially in an independent state.
Okay, thank you very much. That was great. So Marcelo, if I can get a quick response from you so that we can talk about some limitations before we go to the Q&A. So concision is key.
Concision is key. Wow. How? I just wanted to destroy this guy, and now you're taking me.
Yeah, I'm so sorry to do this to you.
Oh, the pleasure. Okay, I'll try to be very short. Listen, what this guy, what's his name, Adam Kirsch is doing, he's playing the game of classification. And, you know, with the game of classification, what you do is how to include or exclude articles. So he spreads before us a series of parameters or features and says, well, this sticks, this doesn't. So therefore, the case of Israel and Zionism is not settler colonialism. So let me just take one thing that Teodora didn't talk about, because she really encompassed most of the ridiculous arguments that Kirsch proposed in that article. And I'll address just one remaining, which is something that can be persuading if you are not a good reader, which is, well, you know, one of the main aspects of Zionism is that it differs from other settler colonial projects in the sense that it began as a national project. So in fact, nationalism came first, and only later, when these people, very enthusiastic of their own nationalism, came into the land, they began developing their settler colonialism. And that nationalism that I'm mentioning is indeed related, and I do agree. I don't think we can dismiss the idea. I mean, Rashid Khalidi doesn't, so who I am to do it, that indeed Jewish people have a connection, a historical connection, somehow an historical connection with the Holy Land. So if you are very strict with this, so these people are not coming into a new land and taking ownership, but they are actually returning. So question is how we cope with this idea of returning to a place. How can you at all claim that people that have a connection with the land that they are returning to can be in any way be seen as settler colonials? How can you even apply the framework of settler colonialism to this kind of people. And the question I'm going to ask, just to keep playing the game of classification, is, well, we have just one test here. Is this issue of the provenance, and the connection of the incoming people, is this issue something that is excluding the historical fact that perhaps ethnocide has been committed in Palestine from very early 20th century for sure? And the answer is simply no, because it doesn't matter really where you come from and what were your original motivations or what your connections to the place are, if you are still not considering the mode of your return. So I do accept that at some level we may call these Jewish immigrants becoming settler people who are returning. There are lots of caveats here, but we don't have the time to enter into them. But let's accept this premise. Yes, they did return. It doesn't matter. I'm still want to ask, how they return. What was the mode of their return? And the mode of their return, this is the point where we come back to the settler colonial paradigm, because they did displace, they did replace, so they did ethnocide, and still they were also returning. So the returning issue is not a threshold category, a threshold element with which you can play and say, no, this is not working, I throw out of the window and the paradigm cannot be applied. Settler colonial framework is still good social law for the case of Zionism, because we actually know what these people have done and still do.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So I might get you to pick your favorite limitation, as it were, because of where we are at. So turning now to what you consider to be some of the limitations of the settler colonial paradigm, Teodora, what kind of limitation came to mind for you?
Decolonization.
Yep.
Settler colonialism remains stuck in perpetual settler colonialism. And I don't clearly see through that paradigm the possibility for decolonization. The call for it is there, but I've not seen any solutions. But this is why I started activism, because the activists are thinking about decolonization.
So just for some of our audience, why is it so? What do you mean by this? Why is it that settler colonial theory calls for decolonization but can't really provide it?
Partly it is because it is heavily indebted to the majority of the settler colonial world being characterized by Anglophone settler colonies that have reduced indigenous populations to single digits and established very, very strongly entrenched settler colonial national identities. And then with each wave of new migrants, whether you want to call them settlers but not colonizers, they are incorporated into the settler colonial order. So if I have no doubt, for example, that if I move to Australia or to Canada, as much as I do the land acknowledgements, I will become Australian or Canadian at some point.
Yeah. Thank you. And Marcelo, do you have one limitation for us?
I have one, but this time, Jack, I need you to give me a bit more of time to expand. I think I would like to say a bit more now. First of all, I think that the limits of this theory or paradigm are because of the way scholars develop this paradigm, and not because they are necessarily inherent to the theory. And I feel, and this is what I've been devoting my time to, that the limit that our colleagues have placed on this theory is that they have a kind of obsession, I would I think Foucault would have said, with the state, with the institutions of the state, and with high politics. What I call in my first answer the question of the agent of ethnocide. When you read the Settler Colonial articles, works on this issue, for the most part, it seems that Israeli settler colonial practices are studied as practices without perpetrators. It's always the state that does everything. So it's always the state and the institutions that colonize, but little to nothing is done to understand what I consider to be a very significant point, which is why and how Israelis themselves, people, individuals, groups, find themselves always readily making themselves available in a variety of everyday acts, prolonging that ethnocide. So in one place I showed, I did kind of statistical analysis of all the major journals working on settler colonialism about Palestine and Israel, and I found that almost none dealt with this question of the Israeli subject or Israeli subjectivity and the role of this subject and subjectivity in the continuation, in the prolongation of settler colonialism in Palestine. But listen, we can put this differently. If Israeli formal institutions, so I go here with my colleagues, if Israeli formal institutions rely on, and they must rely on, Israeli citizens to execute and maintain settler colonial domination, how come we are not scrutinizing the settler colonial subject? So there is a gap here. There is a gap between settler colonial deeds, settler colonial acts, and the question of the formation of the perpetrator subjectivity. Now, I must say that this line of work does exist when we come to read about Canada, Australia, New Zealand, even the United States, but not about Palestine. Now, if you give me 2 more minutes, can I have them, Jack?
You have them, you have them.
Thank you. So I reckon people in the audience know that in Israel, the military service is compulsory, and there is only a very thin layer of professional soldiers, but it's based on conscription. And though the enrollment for service is legally compulsory, serving in the military until these very days is the most significant element of social cohesion in the Israeli society. Okay, we need to understand this to figure out how come we see Israelis voluntarily giving themselves, lending themselves to a range of practices that perpetuate the ethnocide of the Palestinian people. How is the military rule in the West Bank managed? These are not just soldiers. How was the siege of Gaza Strip administered since 2007, since the siege was put on the Gaza Strip? We are talking here about civil administrators, business contractors, regular workers, Israeli citizens, ordinary Israeli citizens. The decades-long discrimination of Palestinian citizens of Israel, I'm talking about 21% approximately of Israeli citizenry, these are Palestinian people. So who does that discrimination? Bureaucrats, bankers, people working in ministerial offices, local and regional councils, people in charge of implementation of different rules for Jews and Palestinians concerning everything: allocation of municipal budgets, allowances, funds for education, provision for land, development, public transport, mortgage rates and rights. The list goes on and on, obviously. All this stuff is done by people, recruiting personnel in HR departments, in the public sector, in the private sector, continuing a century-long tradition of preferring Jewish employees over Palestinians, a policy that was invented by the Histadrut, the union workers of the Zionist movement in Palestine from 1920. Israeli teachers manufacturing and inculcating the insignificance of Palestinian life. Journalists actively participating in the incitement against Palestinians. I follow Israeli journalism, TV, newspapers every day. You can't believe the kind of statements and propositions that are aired nowadays since October 7 last year. And then we get to the main actors, really, parents, the highest of all collaborators, passing on the torch of militarism and nationalism to the children, actively supporting the recruitment of these children. This is very, very important. I'm not talking about crazy settlers in the West Bank. I'm not talking about those who vandalize Palestinian property in the West Bank. I'm talking about my siblings in Israel, my cousins, my wife's family member. I'm talking about ordinary people. And this obviously brings us into a field of study that not many wants to touch on, because it brings us into those studies about what ordinary people in Germany did, how they were so voluntarily ready to do everything they done. But I believe that this is very missing in settler colonial writing nowadays. It must be emphasized, because if we want to try to understand, as Teodora proposed rightly so, how can we escape from this situation? We need first to understand how the mind of the perpetrator works, how that commitment is built, both historical and also in the present. I apologize that it was this a bit too long.
No, that's all right. I think it actually helps us pivot into the first question. So I'm going to stick with you for a moment, because, you know, you're talking there about the everyday life of Israelis, the kind of subjectivities that get formed. And I have a question related to that, which is, what would Israelis divesting from Zionism look like? What would decolonization of Israel look like in practice, both for Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs, who make up 20% of Israel's citizens?
Well, it exists to begin with. I don't want in any way to ridicule or minimize the efforts of my friends over there doing great work on many fronts for many decades, and they are not giving up, and they work on education, at times in joint organizations with Palestinians from within Israel that are citizens, at times with Palestinians, particularly from the West Bank. There are a myriad of organizations that have been doing a great work. The problem is quantity. The problem is numbers. We are talking here about a very tiny minority of the Israeli Jewish population. And when you want to transform a society, which this is what I'm trying to talk about, you need numbers. You need a critical mass of people. We don't have that. That's the main problem.
Excellent. And Teodora, do you want to touch that one?
Very briefly, just to say that decolonization has to include the commitment to the right of return, the Palestinian right of return, for those who were dispossessed. In 1948, they should be able to return, and that is the only conversation that can truly lead to decolonization. It cannot be excluded from any kind of conversation about decolonization and coexistence.
Okay, great. And I have another question here. How do notions of guilt play into settlers' construction of their own identities? Or are there key or common ways in which settlers deal with their histories of domination and displacement? Teodora?
I think right now the answer is that from my reading of what's going on, there is a denial in process. I don't think in order to feel guilt and to be dealing with guilt, one has to acknowledge that one has displaced, and that isn't taking place. On the contrary, the opposite is happening. So repudiating the idea that it's a settler colonial situation, repudiating the idea that the Palestinian people, the indigenous or one of the indigenous communities on the land of historic Palestine and what is also today the state of Israel and the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, there is a denial about it. And a refusal to acknowledge. There is a refusal to acknowledge.
So any guilt would actually have to be premised on some initial acknowledgement, which isn't happening. Yeah. Marcelo?
Well, I think shame comes before guilt. Guilt is the moment that you actually are ready to sit on the bench and be the defendant on this story. And we are miles away from that in Israel. And I would like to focus just on that Jewish majority that I was talking about. I can't focus on the tiny minority of friends and colleagues that I know from there that are trying to do a good job, but they're really, the numbers, I would say, almost obliterate their cause. But no, there is no shame there, mate. There is no shame. There is actually a very radicalizing sentiment of very ordinary people. Again, it's important to use the term in the sense of, particularly since October the 7th, this is what they deserve. Then it's either I don't know what's happening and I don't care, or I know what's happening and it's okay, and they can go on and they need to learn a lesson. It's all about vengeance. There is no room whatsoever in the public sphere for any sentiment that comes close to shame.
Thank you. Okay. So I've got one for Teodora specifically. I've got a questioner who asks, what you mean when you say that Israel hasn't created a nationality or nation in the same way that the US or Australia has? And if you're able to talk more on that, clarify that.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. Okay, so since 2018, Israel passed a new nationality law that dropped the word democratic from its constitutional description. So Israel is a Jewish state. It used to be a Jewish and democratic state. Now it is just a Jewish state. And so the nationality that Israel has created for its settler colonization of Palestinian land is Jewish and not Israeli. So that's what I meant. That if that we could be moving towards something that looks like being American or being Australian or being Canadian, that potentially has more possibilities to be decolonial. It is not. So those states also have a colonizing nationality that they have created, but has the possibility to be decolonial because it's about citizenship. So your nationality is in relation to your citizenship, not in your relation to your ethnicity. So this is what I mean by that. So for me, actually, it would be very important, and it's a tiny minority of decolonial Israelis who have been petitioning the High Court for years to ask for Israeli nationality to be recognized, because it is not recognized. So they want to be Israeli, and you don't have to be Jewish or Christian or Muslim to be Israeli. You could just be Israeli, but that doesn't exist at the moment. And the 2018 nationality law has completely shut this down. And also one of the things that they did is that they removed Arabic as an official language. So now Hebrew is the only official language.
Excellent, thank you. So Marcelo, one for you. Does the way in which does the trauma inherited from the Holocaust play some role in explaining the ongoing ethnocide, as you put it, from one questioner?
I don't know. I don't believe that if a wrong is committed against you, you need to carry it forward onto other people. I mean, I think I have people who have survived the Holocaust in my own family. Half of my family perished in the Holocaust from both sides, my mom and dad. So I know very closely those sentiments that the question is raising, but I think my position is very strict here. You don't do to others, you know, what you didn't like be done to you. End of story.
Yep, good. Okay, and Teodora, do you want to handle that one as well?
I'm Bulgarian, and we have a very different history to the rest of Europe when it comes to the Holocaust. For me, actually, okay, just very briefly, the Jews of Bulgaria were not subjected to the same exterminationist practices as the rest of European Jews during the Holocaust. And something like 45 out of the 50,000 Bulgarian Jews who found themselves in Bulgaria still after the Holocaust, they left for Israel in 1950. And they are one of the first founders of the state. And that is a history that's often not told because Bulgaria is just not that important and is a tiny little Eastern European country. But we are one of the first settlers, the first post-state settlers that established the state of Israel. And so there is a kind of, you know, I cannot speak to that relationship to the Holocaust, but I can speak to the fact that the Bulgarian Jewish population that moved to Israel played a very pivotal role in the establishment of the State of Israel and how it has panned out since. And so there is a role there as well to be played in terms of taking responsibility for the colonized Palestinians and thinking about a relationship of justice, a relationship of reparation, of restoration, of acknowledgement, and possibly of decolonial coexistence.
Thank you very much. Marcelo, do you have any concluding thoughts, or either of you really? We just have a couple of minutes before we have to wrap up here.
Yeah, I would like to join Teodora in the argument about the problem of decolonization or transformation or escapes, however you call it. So from my own perspective, my conclusion about my understanding of the Israeli Jewish society and their commitment to the continuation of settler colonialism there is that you need to be very realistic when you talk about political models as reasonable solutions to this situation. I believe that right now it's just useless to talk about this issue. It's redundant. We need to focus on what exactly Teodora was talking about, how we can manage to move forward to escape, first of all, this situation of extreme domination by the Israeli regime. And given that the hope is not going to come from the inside for all the reasons that I mentioned. So my conclusion, I think, and it's perhaps the logical conclusion, is that it must come from the outside. And coming from the outside means that the international community must check themselves itself and be ready to impose a very large range of sanctions, political sanctions, legal sanctions of the state of Israel to start putting real pressure on this regime in order to restrict its action towards the Palestinian people. I cannot see any other way but as it happened with the case of South Africa. Similarly, we need to work harder to bring people from the outside of Israel-Palestine to support the BDS campaign and more broadly international sanctions by the international community.
Okay, thank you very much for that rousing conclusion there. And I think that's where we'll draw a line under the discussion. So it just remains for me to say thank you to everyone. So firstly to our panelists, Marcelo and Teodora, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you for organizing this.
No worries. I learned a lot in reading your works in the lead up to this, for which I'm quite grateful. And thank you to the audience as well for your attention, your time, and your thoughtful questions. And of course, thank you to the UNAA Queensland branch for platforming us. I would just like to remind you that we do have some more panels lined up, so stay tuned. So thanks to everyone, and do enjoy the rest of your night. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.